ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Но утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 23rd of November, 2025, and here we are with the latest in our series on the Great October Revolution, Part 3, the Treaty of Brest Litovsk and other matters which arise in the period immediately after the revolution. So I'm going to be dealing with that tonight. Be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. And yes, tonight we are proceeding onwards with our series and going to be looking at the dismissal of the Constituent Assembly. Going to be looking at the attempts by the Bolsheviks to end the Russian involvement in World War I and the various different interested parties who didn't want to see that involvement end, and also the civil war, should we say, the class war in the countryside, and the successful attempt to overcome the resistance of the of the kulaks in the countryside when it came to grain production and also the distribution of grain to the cities. So, thanks everybody who's tuned in thus far. We will get straight into this and look at the picture that emerges immediately after the seizure of power. See, the first two episodes we covered. In episode 1, we were covering the dual power situation as analyzed by Lenin, how that was brought ultimately to a close, and the background to the October Revolution. Now, in episode 2, we looked at the seizure of power itself, the insurrection, and the immediate consequences of that. Now we're looking at, well, the Bolsheviks have formed a new government. So what are the first few actions that they have to take? Now, remember, as Lenin emphasized, they had a clear mandate from the Congress of the Soviets to pursue a basic policy of peace, bread, and land. And let's remind ourselves what that means. That means ending the war, peace. Bread means actually being able to feed the cities, because the whole disintegration of the Tsardom had been started by a food riot, bread riot in Petrograd. And that was because the supply of food to the cities had completely broken down. Now, bear in mind that Russia is a potentially very productive country when it comes to the growth of cereal crops and also the rearing of animals for meat and dairy. But the system of agriculture, dominated by the major Russian landowners, had become so horrendously inefficient by 1917 under the stresses and strains of war that they weren't able to feed the civilian population anymore. And this is what leads to massive queues for bread and bread riots, because, of course, the working class in Petrograd and Moscow and other urban centers knew very well that some people in the country were eating very well, and it certainly wasn't them. And so, therefore, the Bolsheviks knew that they had to resolve that issue. Also, and that directly connected to that, is the issue of land, the power of the kulaks, and also the insidious influence of the small to medium-sized landowners in the countryside in suppressing the landless and small peasants. Now, all of these things, again, the Congress of Soviets immediately a few weeks before had authorized or endorsed, I should say, the Bolshevik plan to pursue these the agenda of peace, bread, and land. So one of what happens immediately after the seizure of power is that the Bolsheviks move to consolidate the new system and strengthen the new system, and that means, of course, doing away with the old ministries of the bourgeois state. Now, as we covered in previous episodes, previous programs done on this channel, the bourgeois machinery of state was abolished, and the new system was built on but it did include, of course, personnel from the old system. So there was a certain holdover of personnel from the bourgeois state. Now, so that's worth bearing in mind. But the old ministries and the old government was abolished. New ones were put in place, named People's Commissariats. There was a Council of the National Economy set up to administer the industry of the country. And of course, you get, in those early days, the advent of the Cheka under Felix Dzerzhinsky, which we'll cover more in later episodes. But one of the things that I'm trying to get across through this series is the way that the problems faced by revolutionaries in Soviet Russia and later in the Soviet Union remained consistent in terms of counter-revolutionary tendencies, in terms of ultra-leftist tendencies. And it took a very strong party with very deep connections with the masses, and a leadership who understood, as Lenin and Stalin did, the rhythm of the struggle in order to get the approach on each issue correct. Now, at each stage in the unfolding of the revolution, even in its earliest days, similar problems emerge. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the some of those. So we covered last time how there were reactionary, or I should say, right opportunist splits in the Bolshevik party hierarchy itself, Zinoviev, Kamenev, etc. There were ultra-left splits, people like Radek and Trotsky. There was the left social revolutionary group who were in coalition with the Bolsheviks for the early part of 1918, only to split very rapidly afterwards. And the big problems that, again, kept coming up throughout the period of the Soviet Union were all there at the beginning. And it's interesting, therefore, to look at the way in which Lenin managed these and the way in which revisionists later on completely cocked these up. So the three big things that happen in this period immediately before the outbreak of the Civil War proper are that the Constituent Assembly, which had been elected prior to the revolution, prior to the Congress of Soviets that endorsed the Bolshevik plan for peace, bread, and land, the Constituent Assembly, which represented a bourgeois institute, which was a bourgeois institution, did meet immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Bolsheviks dismissed it. Now, this causes reformists and some revisionists to have meltdowns every time this is mentioned. But I will just simply say here that the abolition of the Constituent Assembly was completely justified. Why? Because it represented a lower form of state and government and than the Soviet system did. It represented a bourgeois form of government, and its class composition was bourgeois. It was dominated by people who wanted to put in place a bourgeois government in Russia. And so, therefore, it was completely the correct decision to get rid of it and to dismiss it. And the actions of those who complain the longest and the hardest about the dismissal of the Constituent Assembly, their subsequent political trajectory reveals what they would have done. See, what those who, like the likes of Kautsky and others at the time, who demanded that the Constituent Assembly be restored, what their position was essentially a pro-capitalist position, as Kautsky's later career trajectory made completely clear. Now, the Constituent Assembly was, in effect, attempting to restore a dual power situation, because the authority of the new government drew directly from the Soviets, whereas what the Constituent Assembly was trying to do was to essentially interject a layer of bourgeois government into a new Soviet-based system. And that would only have led to a recreation of the dual power situation, which is absolutely fatal when you're waging a revolutionary battle. You're waging a revolution to eliminate bourgeois rule. So we talked last week about the earliest stages of the Bolshevik led revolution saw things like the complete cancellation of all Russian foreign debt that had been taken on by the Tsardom and by the bourgeois provisional government. But it also saw things like the maneuvers like the nationalization of industry, banks, railways, the state monopoly being placed on foreign trade, the nationalization of the Russian mercantile fleet, and all large enterprises in all branches of industry. So the coal industry, metalworking industry, oil, chemicals, machine building, textiles, sugar, these were all nationalized. See, that's not just, an economic maneuver designed to build the basis for the planned economy, even though that's a huge part of it. But you're also depriving the bourgeoisie of any of their major industries. the major bits of the economy that they derived profit from, and that are the basis of their power, you've essentially done away with all of them by nationalizing all the banks. I mean, Lenin, as Lenin says in Imperialism, the high stage of capitalism, banks played the central role under imperialism. Banks played an absolutely crucial role in bourgeois Russia. You nationalize all the banks. You deprive the bourgeois of a huge element of their power. You nationalize all the major transportation networks. You nationalize, or you have a state monopoly of foreign trade. Again, you are literally choking off the oxygen to the bourgeois system, to the profit system. You're denying the bourgeoisie access to their power. And that essentially leads to a situation where the bourgeoisie's power declines exponentially in Russia following those moves. And that's what you would need to do, to be blunt, in any revolutionary situation. In up to this day, there's no ways around that. In any situation, is particularly in an advanced nation or an imperialist nation, as Russia was at the time, you would need to take over the banks first of all, but then you'd also need to nationalize all the hedge funds, pension funds, etc., seize all of their assets, and then also seize all the key industries, transportation, all the major sites of production you would need to take control of. And so that's should we say, a move by the Bolsheviks, which is still relevant in terms of the kind of things we should be putting forward to this day. You can't come to power in the way that the Bolsheviks did, or even as a supposed social democrat who has a sincere desire to carry out a socialist transformation. You can't come to power and then just leave the bourgeoisie in place. That's absolutely fatal. I mean, if we're going to make a comparison, if you leave the bourgeoisie in place, not only is it the case that they will be able to economically blackmail the country, but also that they will engage in multiple conspiracies and sabotage actions against any pro-worker or socialist government. So depriving them of their property, depriving them of their profit, depriving them of the ability to essentially train wreck the economy. All of these are absolutely crucial moves you can make. And added to that is, of course, the getting rid of any institution which is bourgeois. And this was why the Constituent Assembly was abolished and why it had to go. Now, I invite you all to flash forward 70 years to the later period in the Soviet Union, where Gorbachev is desperately attempting to restore bourgeois rule in the Soviet Union. This is what he is doing. He is essentially attempting, successfully, unfortunately, to restore some version of the Constituent Assembly via, they call it the Congress of People's Deputies. It was meant to dilute the power of the CPSU and dilute further working class rule. And so the form of government that emerged after 1917 was one that was based upon working class rule in alliance with the peasantry, and therefore doing away with bourgeois institutions, doing away with the power of the bourgeoisie, doing away with bourgeois governmental institutions. In the counter-revolution of the 1980s, Gorbachev restores the power of, attempts to restore the power of both. Attempts to restore the power of the bourgeoisie in terms of the economy via his privatization moves, and attempts to restore the power of the bourgeoisie in terms of the reintroduction of bourgeois systems of government. So this is shows us quite clearly the revolutionary nature of the early period and the counter-revolutionary nature of the later period. But again, like roughly the same debates and the same breakdown of class positions can be found at each stage. And what it goes to show is that not only is it the case that you need to fight to abolish the power of the bourgeoisie economically and politically, but then you need to fight to make sure that it stays suppressed. And if you think that that fight has been won after a generation, as some did in the USSR, which is why Khrushchev got away with doing away with the dictatorship of the proletariat, you are entirely wrong. The bourgeoisie's power will grow back like a particularly noxious and foul weed. So the abolition of the Constituent Assembly makes complete sense, because why would you give the Russian bourgeoisie a parliament to play with when you are essentially expropriating them? And by the way, I think we should be more clear and also be unashamed in our propaganda about the need for the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. The capitalist class has worked incredibly hard to try and get workers to believe that they are the ones who will get expropriated by the evil communists. But we should be absolutely clear that what we aim to do is to, following the Bolshevik example, take control of all the key aspects of the economy and dispossess the parasites. That would be actually a popular measure. We're going to dispossess the parasites who control things and seek to suck the lifeblood out of the system. These would be popular measures if explained properly. So, the Bolsheviks seek to root out the power of the bourgeoisie. Now, they are, of course, left with a huge problem, which is that the entirety of the system is under threat from the continuation of the war. The continuation of the war means basically that German imperialism continues to maraud forward, and the promise to the proletariat and the peasantry, which was clearly made by the Bolsheviks to secure a peace, needs to be followed up on. Now, in this initial period after the revolution, they have Trotsky as Commissar for Foreign Affairs. And he was charged with the responsibility of going to the Central Powers, which means the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, to negotiate a peace treaty. And this happens in early 1918. So Trotsky is charged by the Bolshevik Central Committee to go and negotiate a peace treaty, even and accept the invidious terms that German imperialism was presenting. Now, why was this necessary? It's just important to pause here, because the Treaty of Brest Litovsk, as it was to become, is still a controversial thing in certain quarters to this day. You'll find anti-communists in the West banging on about it being a Lenin sold out Russia. You will find Russian nationalists also saying the same thing. But why was it necessary? It was necessary because by early 1918, it was transparently obvious that the army that existed, the old army of the Tsardom, was no longer in a position to fight. They couldn't stand up to the relentlessness of the advance of the German imperialists. The army needed to be completely and utterly reorganized to actually reflect the new class basis of the system, of the new governmental system in what was then Soviet Russia to become the USSR. So the army that existed had fallen to pieces. Its officer corps was in the process of, if not defecting to the counter-revolution immediately, then in the process of trying to sabotage any effective resistance. So there needed to be time for the new government to essentially consolidate its position, and they couldn't do that if they were continually losing territory to the German imperialists. There needed to be peace in order for them to first of all fulfill the commitment made to the workers and peasants, and also to be able to actually better exploit the divisions between the imperialists. Now, remember in our first episode where we talked about how Lenin analyzed that one of the reasons why the revolution stood a chance of succeeding in Russia was precisely because the imperialists were divided amongst themselves still. So the French and the British even after the revolution in Russia, the October Revolution, that is, were still locked in a struggle with the Germans. Now, immediately after coming to power, the Bolsheviks issued a pronouncement saying that inviting all belligerent parties in the conflict to start negotiations, and they all refused. Well, the French and the British certainly refused. They were desperate for the Russians to continue the war, because if they didn't, then suddenly hundreds of thousands of German troops could be released from the Eastern Front to go west. Now, the German aims in the war, we've covered this before, but it's worth reiterating. The German aims in World War I were for the conquest of Poland, much of what is now Ukraine, and much of what is now Poland and the Baltic states in Western Russia. So the Germans wanted all of that, basically. And this is why you have, of course, after the signing of the Brest Litovsk Treaty, you have pro-German comprador elements in the Baltic states that keep on basically trying to keep the Baltic nations in servitude to German imperialism all the way up to the Great Patriotic War, where they sold the Baltic states to the Nazis. Now, this is what the German imperialists wanted. These were their demands in the initial negotiations over the treaty to end the war. Now, the arguments made by Trotsky as to his conduct in these negotiations are very interesting, because what Trotsky and his defenders argue is that the great Trotsky went to these negotiations and made a heroic speech telling the German imperialists to go to hell, and we won't negotiate with you. Now, so how did that translate into reality? Because Trotsky's actions here are still defended by very many prominent Trotskyites, that he went to this negotiation and he made an anti-imperialist speech to the assembled German military commanders. So what he actually announced there, in complete contravention of the decision of the Central Committee, which he was bound by collective discipline to implement, Trotsky went to these negotiations and said that the new Soviet Republic would refuse to conclude peace on the terms proposed by Germany. Again, that goes completely against what he was actually instructed to do, and also that the Soviet Republic would not fight and would continue to demobilize their army. So essentially, not only was Trotsky saying to the German imperialists that there would be no peace treaty, but also that there would be no army either. So this is a absolutely bizarre decision, and again goes against the decision made by the party, goes against the program that the party put before the masses prior to the October Revolution. So why did Trotsky do it? Now, Trotsky's justifications for this in his writings later, and he gives an account of this in his own histories of the Russian Revolution. He says later that this was all about him trying to inspire the German Revolution, and that this was the reason why he conducted himself in the way that he did. Now, of course, he didn't move the German Revolution forward one iota himself. In the end, the revolution in Germany broke out, well, because of starvation and because of a mutiny in the German High Seas Fleet that broke out in later 1918 and spread all over the country. So the way in which Trotsky justifies this was directly related to the prospects of the revolution in Germany, something which he will continue to obsess over, though, of course, Trotsky never did anything much to actually aid a revolution in Germany, but he talked about it a lot. Now, Trotsky was backed up in this by in this sort of ludicrous position by the likes of Bukharin and the left social revolutionaries. Now, what essentially this did in his refusal to actually conclude the treaty on the grounds which had been agreed by the Bolshevik Party at its highest levels. What this did was it gave the Germans the chance to carry on advancing into Russia, with the army falling apart, and the Bolsheviks had to rush quickly to reform or form the basis for the new Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. And but this would take a while, and this was something that they couldn't do overnight. They needed the war against the Germans to be brought to an end. So the actions of Trotsky in this particular episode again raise questions as to, well, who was he actually working for? Because again, like, one can take the point of view that Trotsky was just an ultra leftist, that he was just a guy who like swung wildly from one extreme to the other due to his inherently petty bourgeois politics. And this explains this sort of inconsistency and instability explains his actions. And there's certainly something to that. This is a consistent theme of Trotsky and Trotskyism. But is there more to it than that? Now, there's persistent rumors that Trotsky was actually some kind of agent of the imperialist powers, that he was constantly seeking to sabotage things, that there's also other stories that he did everything just because he was an egomaniac and wanted to be the center of attention. It's probably a combination of all of the above, would be my interpretation. Certainly, Trotsky had some association with foreign intelligence services. I believe he had. I think he had some associations with the British and with those in the United States. Remember, Trotsky, towards the end of his life, was offering to rat out Mexican and American communists to a U.S. congressional committee, the predecessor of the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is prior to World War II. So he certainly had a very dodgy past and present at that time. There's even rumors that he was actually, in the pay of the Germans and remained so for the rest of his career. Again, I don't have any evidence of that, but certainly his decision making went directly. He breached party discipline. He directly went against what had been endorsed, and so the Germans continued their advance, and they had to scramble to defend against the oncoming German advance. And so February the 23rd, 1918, was when the Bolsheviks managed to draw together the first elements of the Red Army. And it was February the 23rd that is considered to be the birth date of the Great Red Army, because that was the first time that the new army had been able to repulse a German assault on Pskov. Now, the Bolsheviks, and again, Lenin, under Lenin's urging, again sent a message to the German High Command, and on February the 22nd, the Germans said that they were willing to sign a peace, but it was a much more onerous peace than had previously been on the table. So which included basically the Bolsheviks having to give up considerably more territory, like most of what had been, all of what had been Russian Poland, a huge chunk of, again, what is now Ukraine, all the way up to, of course, the border of the Baltic states. So this is like, and also they had to agree to pay an indemnity to the German invaders, and it was this that saw the Germans set up a Ukrainian puppet state under the predecessors of the Banderites, who are essentially acting as their local puppets. So a Ukrainian state became a vassal of Imperial Germany for a brief period towards the end of the First World War. Interestingly enough, this comes up again in the 1930s with Trotsky calling for Ukraine to be separated from the Soviet Union. And again, who would have been the principal beneficiary of that in the late 1930s? Well, I think it might have been a certain Austrian failed watercolor artist and his plans. Because again, the plans of German imperialism don't change really between 1914 all the way through to 1945. They're still looking for the same thing. They're still looking for domination over the land and the potential labor power of Eastern Europe. So Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, but particularly like Ukraine and Western Russia, the German imperialists are looking for control to be established over that. And this is the way in which, of course, things keep playing out. So there is a Congress called of the Bolshevik Party on March 6, 1918, and Lenin gets his position on the signing of the peace there endorsed by that Congress. Trotsky, Bukharin, and a number of others keep denouncing this, and they continue to try and split the Congress and continue to try and flout party discipline. As you'll know from our series on the opposition in the 1920s, this was a big thing that Trotsky would do over and over again, which is a vote would be taken, the majority position would not be to his liking, and he would immediately flout it. Again, he's doing this whilst Lenin is still alive and still in position as chair of the Council of People's Commissars. So the peace that is eventually signed that includes a lot of loss of territory, but Lenin argued successfully and correctly that it was the only choice that was open to them. Had they had to continue fighting German imperialism, the process of the necessary consolidation of Soviet rule and the building blocks to construct the new economy and society would not have been able to be put in place. There would have been no breathing space at all. As it was, the signing of the peace deal gave them a few months in order to organize the new Red Army, to start actually putting in the economic changes necessary to start building the new workers' state and building for socialism that they wouldn't have had if they'd have carried on the war. So it gave them a vital few months to actually have some breathing space and enable them to exploit the still existing divisions between the German imperialists on the one hand and the British and the French imperialists and the US imperialists on the other. Now, remember the war, World War I doesn't come to a conclusion on the Western Front until November of 1918, by which time the Russian Civil War is underway. But it does give them a crucial few months in order to consolidate things. And had the Bukharinites and the Trotskyites got their way, that would not have been the case. And there's every chance that the first workers' state would have been defeated very rapidly. So a perpetually controversial issue, one that is still raised by anti-communists in Russia to this day, but one where the Bolsheviks had to essentially swallow a bitter pill in order to be able to properly reorganize themselves and consolidate Soviet power, which was they managed to successfully do. Now, the other couple of points regarding what's going on here in this early period is you've got the class war in the countryside, which is it sees the battle between the kulaks and the small peasants, and also the hoarding of grain by the kulaks and the refusal to provide it to the cities. Now, this is again something which is seldom talked about in a serious way. Now, what the Bolsheviks sought to do is mobilize the poorest peasants in the countryside in order to actually combat the power of the kulaks. So what they did was create the committees of the poor peasants, and this was a decree issued on June 11th, 1918. And this was designed again to mobilize the poorest elements in the countryside against against the landowning kulaks. Now, I'll just read here an excerpt from the section on this in the history of the CPSU. So this reads as follows. A decree was issued on June 11th, 1918, providing for the creation of committees of the poor peasants. These committees played an important part in the struggle against the kulaks in the redistribution of the confiscated land and the distribution of agricultural implements, in the collection of food surpluses from the kulaks, and in the supply of foodstuffs to the working class centers in the Red Army. 50 million hectares of kulak land passed into the hands of the poor and middle peasants. A large portion of the kulaks' means of production was confiscated and turned over to the poor peasants. So this is the class war in the countryside, where the land of the big landlords needed to be confiscated, and the grain they were hoarding needed to be confiscated, because essentially they were holding a gun to the head of the new government of the cities, and they needed that grain to be provided to the workers and the Red Army in order that the country could actually successfully be defended. And one of the things you see when you look at the anti-communist crap that was put out in the 80s and afterwards by Russian reactionaries is them trying to conjure up the image of the poor peasant tending like a postage stamp size piece of land and have it taken away by the cruel Bolsheviks. In reality, those who got their land confiscated were like the aristocracy for one, the church being another one, because the church was a huge landowner in Tsarist era Russia, and also like those who had benefited from the most from land redistribution in the post the abolition of serfdom. So the new capitalist landlords who had managed to accumulate a great amount of land. It was those landlords who were dispossessed in 1918, and it was their successors in the later 1920s who had their land confiscated and collectivized later on. See, at this stage, the land is going to the poor peasants. In a decade, or just over a decade later, the land would start to be collectivized under the collective farm system. See, this is the Bolsheviks making good on the promise of land to the peasants at this stage. And this is, of course, something which has never been, which the Russian reactionaries will scream is horrible and terrible, and they will always cite the example of the small babushka tending her patch of marsh, who gets it stolen by the Bolsheviks. In reality, these people are just defending the big landowners, because that's who got their land confiscated from them. So slowly you start to see the Bolsheviks are able to deliver upon certain of the commitments that were made under the plan, under the outlined by Lenin prior to the Bolshevik Revolution: peace, bread, and land. The Brest Litovsk Treaty is signed. Peace. The land starts to be redistributed from the kulaks to the small peasants. That's land. And bread is now supplied to the cities. Now, this was done using an element of compulsion on the kulaks. It was done in the war communist period using compulsion. Basically, give us the bread or we'll take it from you by force anyway, or give us the grain, I should say, or it will be taken from you by force. And at the time, given the urgency of the situation, and given the starvation that was facing the cities, that was the entirely correct point of view to take. It was the entire correct policy to take as well. There was really no alternative other than to let the kulaks perpetually blackmail the cities. Now, when the Civil War was over in 1921, the compulsion element was dropped. And again, because the situation changed. And if the situation changes, then you need to reassess what your policy should be. And Lenin was always reminding the party of that. So the other point to emphasize in this period is that what was desperately required within the new state was the ability to actually regenerate industrial production, which had basically fallen off the edge of a cliff by the time you get to 1918, 1919. So again, a controversial move made by the Bolsheviks, which is harped on about by anarchists and other ultra leftists to this day is the introduction of Taylorism into the Soviet Russian factory system. For those not familiar with it, Taylorism is the piece rate system, payment by amount produced. Lenin also called for the imposition of strict discipline in the factories, the stopping people slacking off, clamping down on absenteeism, that kind of thing, because there was an absolutely urgent requirement that industry be got going again. And there needed to be elements of compulsion in there in order to make it get going again. Again, like this is something which at the time, Trotsky, in another wild swing, was all in favor of. In fact, he wrote a book, which we've mentioned before, Terrorism and Communism, criticizing Karl Kautsky and saying that the elements of compulsion under war communism were completely justified. Trotsky then later sort of doubles back on that book later on and tries to sort of distance himself from it, even though while still at the same time sort of defending it. So he ties himself in a complete rhetorical knot during when reflecting later on this period. But again, like the priority was that they needed to get industrial production going again. And if you then have to resort to like typically American capitalist methods, such as the usage of a Taylorist piecework system, in order to motivate workers to get going, to get production going, in order to start actually being able to supply at least the army again with weaponry. And this was successfully applied. And ultimately, this was something which did succeed in regenerating industrial production. Does it come with certain problems? Yes, it does. As did one-man factory management, which was brought in during this time. This was, again, like a necessity because they essentially needed to roll back certain revolutionary moves that had been made in 1917 to 18, because again, like the factories just weren't functioning. And so there was the reintroduction of one-man management, meaning the state would appoint a factory manager who would essentially set the terms of production. Now, this caused a series of disputes involving the trade unions in the Soviet state, early Soviet state, which were usually resolved, which were all resolved in actual fact via negotiation. This is part of what leads to the controversy between Stalin and Trotsky in 1921 over the role of the role of the trade unions. And whereas Stalin is arguing that now the situation is more favorable, now there needs to be the war communist period needs to be moved away from, and the elements of compulsion need to be dropped. And Trotsky is arguing for more compulsion, basically. So this is the situation faced by the Bolsheviks at the dawn of the Civil War period, which is that you have they have delivered on the so thus far on the ending of the war. They are starting to be able to deliver on the promise of bread, but that's again largely down to the imposition of war communism in the town and country, and the land is being redistributed to the poorest peasants. Now, this brings us up to the period where we are facing the beginning of the Civil War and foreign intervention, which is what we'll get to next week. But what I'm going to do now is just going to pause and take some comments and questions from those watching. Be sure to like and share the stream, everybody, if you have not done so already. So, hello to Jerry. Hello to Barney, who says, I need Perfidious Albion explained to me. Perfidious Albion refers to the Albion itself, meaning England, and the untrustworthy, treacherous nature of the British government. It was an insulting term first coined, I believe, by the French, and also taken up by the Spanish. The French reads La perfide Albion, which I think it sounds just as good. So it was an old term used by the French revolutionaries to refer to the British habit of proclaiming themselves loudly to be in favor of fair play, which is always a big British bourgeois thing. But in reality, them being like the worst oath breakers, the worst breakers of treaties, not sticking to any agreement that you ever signed with them, always knifing you in the back. That is essentially why this derogatory term was come up with, because you can't trust the British ruling class with anything. That's why it was that's why the phrase was coined. Hello, the Balkan tourist, Mo Tank, Sid Hatfield, Pat in Bristol, Speedy Bozo, Davey out there in Wales, Comrade Jawad, Peter Carmichael, Anti Matt V, who's listening to the stream from an Ontario meat plant. Good to have you with us. Can I make a video on the Treaty of Riga? Possibly at some point. Hello to Callum, Matt Parker, Robert Zvoronich. Who are the modern day kulaks, landlords? Well, the kulaks were landowners. So a landlord who owns like property wouldn't be an exact fit, because the kulaks actually controlled a certain amount of like means of production, agricultural means of production, meaning the land, meaning heads of cattle, meaning the ability to produce food. So they play a different role to like somebody who's just letting out a flat or a house. The kulaks had a role within production. A modern day landlord who owns property is entirely non-productive in terms of their role in the system. They are just parasites. The kulaks were exploiters, but they at least used to produce something off their land, some of them anyway. Whereas a modern day landlord who owns property is just he's just a parasite. Edward says, how could so many deplorable people in all levels of the USSR come to power under Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev if the leadership under Lenin at the start and of Stalin were honest revolution? How could the dictatorship of the proletariat lead to Khrushchev and corruption at all levels? Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, but what the point I was making earlier was that, again, like the divisions and the reactionary tendencies that went on to create revisionism, they were there from the start. And if you examine what their how things played out in like the 30s and the 40s, a lot of the tendencies that were associated with Khrushchev and Brezhnev, bureaucratism, pro-bourgeois sort of management in the factories, etc., an antipathy to class struggle, like these elements is that under Lenin and under Stalin, there was the CPSU became oversubscribed, or should we say oversubscribed, with managers and intellectuals at the senior levels, fewer workers. Now, the problem, I think, problem gets progressively worse in the later Stalin period, and certainly in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period. And it really relates to the position, not just the position of the party and the masses, but also the consciousness of the masses. the consciousness of the masses in the time of Lenin and Stalin is revolutionary, and the masses are prepared to fight to push forward the revolution. And you have a leadership that understands the need for the revolutionary. The problem that exists right. Sorry about that. That was a cutout of the internet here. Where we are back online again. But just to go back to Edward's question, the more you get bureaucrats and intellectuals who are just representative of middle layers, the more you get pro-capitalist tendencies, and also the less representation you have from the militant working class, and also the point of view as expressed in the Khrushchev period that there's no class struggle needed or required anymore. All of that creates the sort of rot of revisionism, and again disarms the working class. The revisionist tendencies were always there. It's just that Lenin and the Lenin and Stalin periods, there was, for that time, the leadership understood how those could be combated, and later on the leadership falls into the hands of the bureaucrat mid layer pseudo intellectual types who are viscerally hostile to class struggle. Now, we can go back and talk about that more in future streams, but the deterioration in the leadership relates almost exclusively to the attitude that the leadership takes of class struggle, which is that the attitude of the Stalin era leadership was that the parties linked with the masses needed to be continually renewed. That there needed to be more workers educated and brought into the Supreme Soviet and into factory management, etc. Whereas the Khrushchev period represents the triumph of the reactionaries who hated all of that and sought to restore bureaucrat or put in place a more bureaucratic rule without the disturbance of class struggle. But, I mean, those are some reasons, but I mean, we'd need to get into a much greater discussion if to try and pinpoint this. Right. Hello to Gonzalo from Spain. Sid says, Taylorism is often described by SocDems and liberals as specialization inside the workplace instead of a jack of all trades workforce, utopian nonsense. Hello to Michael Wicks out there in San Antonio. Sid says these anarchists and others envision transforming the workforce into some futuristic layout as of dealing with the present day conditions. That's ultra leftism to a T. N. Minkowski says kulaks were hiring poor peasants to work for them, also engaged in the worst usury. That's true. Albert says the Great Patriotic War killed a lot of talented and committed Bolsheviks. Yes, indeed, and left some of the worst, shall we say. So, what we will be covering next week on the next episode of this is the beginning period of the Civil War itself. So, hold on to your hats for that one. It's going to be that's going to be a rather epic journey through the Civil War across the USSR. So that'll be next weekend. I'll be back with you again tomorrow for the regular Q&A live on Patreon at slightly earlier in the day because I'll be I'm attending a meeting in the evening. So keep an eye out for that. We've also got the next episode in the Gramsci series coming up this week, and the next episode in the World Crisis series. So keep an eye out for all of that. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, thank you and good night.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.